So it was the first week of summer break, and if you're a parent, you understand the tenacity and the intensity of that first week. For whatever reason, my wife and I felt as though we were the overseeing party committee for our two sons' very frenetic first week at home with us. And it was frenetic in this way. It felt like we had a lot of different parties that we were going to, and sleepovers and campfires and movie nights, and albeit a really good time. And we enjoy being together as a family. But that eighth morning, that eighth day, the boys came down the stairs, kind of looking at us like, all right, Mom and Dad, do your thing, entertain us. And we said, listen, I got to go back to the shop, and my wife had some projects she was working on, so there was no more white space to play. And we opened up the proverbial back door and a little bit the literal back door and pushed them out and said, go play. Wax old school. Play with your bike, throw a ball around, hang out with your friends. And of course they left all exasperated. I then went to work, and I show up at home that evening in my backyard, and here is my son, a picture of my son laying in a hammock that he made, this old sheet and a couple pieces of rope, of which, by the way, he had been talking about for weeks. But due to his very busy schedule at school and being over-entertained, he never got to it. Sitting on his chest is also a second book that day that he had devoured. And all of a sudden, everything came full circle. About 10 days earlier, my other son's third grade Montessori teacher of decades of history and brilliance in teaching, she brought all the parents and the students together and had this sort of commissioning service to go out into the summer. And she said to us, parents, your default is to try to fill up your kids' summer with all these nuances, all these pieces of entertainment, all this fun, all these camps. She said, maybe the best thing you could do, and she sort of pointed her finger with this sense of wisdom and said, let them be bored. It made sense. Now I'm looking at my son with this grin on his face, lying in this hammock that he had made earlier in the morning, having devoured 2 books, and it was as though he was saying to me, look at what I did, Dad. That the monotony of his morning when he stepped out into that backyard, because we forced him to, was the impetus to his creating. That the impetus, that the founding of some of the things that we make most special in our lives come from a place of boredom. 1929, my great-grandfather started a jewelry store. My grandfather became his clockmaker, my father his watchmaker, and when it was my turn, 4th generation, to be a part of this family firm, I decided I wanted to go off to college. I didn't want to work with my hands. I wanted to live more in the academic systems side of things. So I went and got the proverbial degrees, jumped into the nonprofit sector, and had the time of my life. Traveled to 40-some different countries. I was helping meet international need with U.S. domestic resources and waking up to a whole new way of seeing things. The call of changing the world was being satiated. I was having the time of my life in my early 30s. Another friend of ours, we moved here to Charlotte, and we started a spiritual community called Watershed. Again, another profoundly transformational time in my own life. And for the last 13 years, Watershed has been something that we have focused on with great intensity and great passion as people are waking up to who they really are. But about 8 years ago, I was bumping into 40, a little bit of a maybe midlife crisis thing. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I was bumping into 40, and for 20 years, I had lived in the service sector. Nonprofit, creating systems, creating infrastructure, fundraising. And to be honest with you, I was loving my work, but I was just a little bit bored. It was as though somebody kicked me out into the backyard and said, all right, you got to live with this a little bit, do something, what's next? And I remember in that space just being bored thinking, what's next? What's going to happen next? And I remember in that space thinking, all right, I need to play with something else. I have other friends, I have other people who don't just work their 9-to-5 gig and then come home. Many of you are the same. You have these other sort of proverbial outlets that you have. You might work with your hands, and maybe it's steel or it's wood. Maybe you're into painting or music or art. And for myself, I tried to think, what could I introduce into my life that would maybe stave off some of the monotony that I was experiencing professionally? And I thought, well, I love all things leather. I love a good bag, a good belt, a good wallet. So maybe that will be the medium in which I play. So I bought a hide of leather, a fistful of tools, and I went back to my screened-in porch and made a little makeshift studio, and I began to make. I began to work with my hands, something I had never done. And 3 or 4 nights a week, I would come home and I would make a cuff or a comb sheath, because everybody needs a comb sheath, right? Or a belt or a wallet. And my sons would maybe join me, and I began to find myself waking up. Like, wow, there's something profound about working with my hands. And what I also began to discover, that my other work life was coming alive as well. Around the same time, Steve Jobs comes on the scene with the iPad. And me and however many millions of others, probably many of you, we order the iPad within days of the announcement. It shows up at my house. The box, I open it up on top of the counter, and I laid a towel out on the counter because I didn't want to scratch the iPad, right? I even put some pillows around the floor in case it slid off. And so as I'm unearthing this iPad from this box, I think there was like a light from heaven shining on it. I lifted it and put it on top of the counter. I turned it on, and the first thing I Googled was a case for my iPad. I didn't want this thing to get scratched. And it might have been the first time I ever Googled something and got a big fat 0. The industry had yet to catch up. So I thought, well, I'm going to go back to my little makeshift studio and make a sheath. So I went back there, and this is the sheath that I made. Nothing fancy, really basic, nothing that anybody would clearly want. And so I show it to my wife, and she says, listen, you need to put that on Etsy. I said, babe, I don't deal in Beanie Babies, and I don't knit. Why would I need an Etsy account? And so I relinquished, and I put it on Etsy, and my inbox lit up. People were buying it faster than I could make them. I was having the time of my life. I was working by day at Watershed, and at night, I got to come home and to make something, and these things would pile up, and I could see with my eyes what my hands were creating, and then people were wanting to purchase them, and they were consuming them, and it was this sense of life and energy that I had never experienced. So I began to think, well, what if I make a wallet or a belt and sell that next? Will people buy those? And they did. What if I tout myself as being a custom leather guy? Because after all, I can make an iPad sheath. Clearly, I can do other custom stuff, right? I touted myself as that, and people believed it, and they started having me make things. One customer calls me up and says, listen, I need 150 bags, and I need them in 8 weeks. Can you make it happen? And I had this sort of out-of-body experience where the person there that was me holding the phone was saying something that the person here was freaking out, and clearly he should have said no, but the person holding the phone said, of course, Mr. Smith, we would love to make those bags for you, and hung up. And so all I had was just me. A whole bunch of weeks later and a lot of stress, and everybody that I knew helping me out, we produced and we made that client happy, but I quickly began to realize, we got to scale this better. So I did what every entrepreneur would do. I moved the operations back to my 10 by 10 shed. And I hired a friend of mine, and quickly he went to full-time. I hired a second person. Before I knew it, I had 3 people working in my 10 by 10 shed in my backyard. My neighborhood association and OSHA would have had a hissy fit had they known. And so for a year, they were back there. We moved over to Plaza Midwood where we had our studio for the last 5 years, and now we're literally just down the street here in Elizabeth where I've got 4 amazing creative leathersmiths, 2 beautiful, amazing people who help me run operations, and we are having the time of our lives, and I never would have experienced that had I not allowed myself to sit with that space of boredom. And if my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my father could now meet me over in my studio, they would say, Scott, what we have known for decades, you're finally learning at 20 years into it that there's something sacred, dare I say, in working with your hands. And that never would have been a reality that I would have known had I not somehow realized that the monotony was a place that I needed to rest in. And what began to happen was the world of Watershed and the world of leather, now those 2 spaces are more alive for me than ever before, somehow because I've learned that working with my hands and working in the spiritual community is a way that I guess I get to do and live in 2 different spaces. University research says this, that when you and I sit with boredom, we have this longing to do something, and the research uses this word, something meaningful. That monotony actually breeds something that is of consequence. So when you dream about that nonprofit, or when you dream about your business, or when you dream about maybe taking that marriage that feels boring, and you dream about what else it could look like, or parenting, or your career, that the impetus to creativity might be boredom. It might be monotony. But here's the tension that I'm living with. Again, there's other research out there that says, New York Times says up to 85% of us are unhappy in our work. Some other research says 50% of us are unhappy in our work. So it's very possible that at least half of us, dare I say, are bored with what we do 40 plus hours a week. So if boredom is the impetus to creativity, then why is it that more and more of us aren't finding sort of waking up to a new way of being or a new way of becoming? I think it's a relatively simple answer. About 10 or 12 years ago, remember when you would go into like the doctor's office, you walk into a waiting room and you're always waiting at least 15 to 30 minutes in an office for whatever reason. And what would you do? You would sit down and you might pick up the Dated People magazine and you might start fanning through the magazine. It might be a relatively numbing experience because your mind probably is elsewhere. It might have been in the meeting that you had earlier or the fight that you had the night before, or maybe, just maybe you're thinking about the vacation coming up, or maybe your mind in that space of boredom is dreaming about something of consequence. Dreaming about what else could be. But invariably, here's what happens nowadays. If you have 15 extra minutes, what do? Pull out your phone, right? And what do we do with our phones if we have that time? Generally 2 things. The first thing we typically do is we get productive. I mean, after all, you're billable at $500 an hour. You got 15 minutes. You better help the bottom line. And so you begin emailing, you begin texting. You get stuff done. Or if you don't get productive, then you jump into entertainment mode, social media, gaming, whatever it might be. And what begins to happen is we numb ourselves from the luxury of being bored with something as trite as technology, and in doing so, we miss out on the opportunities of what else could be, what you could become. And so maybe the wisdom that I can give you today is not mine, but that of my son's 3rd grade Montessori teacher, when she, in so many words, commissioned us as parents and as kids, as I will to you today. If you want to experience transformation in your life, if you want to experience change, if you want to gamble what a new future could look like, if you want to play with a different destiny, if you want to wake up to a potential new reality, maybe the best thing you can do is to allow yourself to be bored.